Okay. Well, welcome to you all. And our topic today is synchronicity. It's one of Jung's most beautiful and far-reaching teachings. He himself came up with the word, and it's a combination of two Greek words. S-Y-N means with or connecting, and this part, C-H-R-O-N, is of course time. So it's when time and timing come together in such a way that you have a sense that something from beyond your ordinary body-mind has clicked in and is somehow at work in your life. And his simplest way of explaining it is that an exterior event will somehow match up, be coincident with an internal event. Simplest example would be you have a dream that's very disturbing about your sister who lives in another state. You wake up, you look at the clock, it says 3 a.m. You go back to sleep, but you're troubled. Next morning, you call your sister. Her husband answers, says, "Oh, she's not here. We had to take her to the emergency room last night about 3 a.m. this morning because she had some type of stroke." So now you make this connection. Somehow I picked up on a disturbing event in my sister's life, and the exterior event matches what I dreamed about. That would be an example of synchronicity, because the time came together between you and your dream and the event that your sister was experiencing. I'll give another example which I always have found very fascinating. Jung had a patient, a man, who had a very strong fear of walking on outdoor stairs, kind of stairs we have here in San Francisco. Takes you from one street up to the next one. And Jung realized, well, this is an irrational fear, a phobia, and he worked with this patient for many months on releasing him from his phobia, but he was never really successful. So after a while, the therapy came to an end, and Jung was still unsatisfied. The man still had this fear. But in any case, they decided to end the analysis. A couple of years later, Jung was reading the newspaper in the morning and read that the day before there had been what we would now call a terrorist attack. Somebody was firing a gun, and by chance, this patient who was walking up outdoor stairs was killed by a stray bullet. So Jung said to himself, "Oh, it never was a phobia. It was a message to him, stay away from these outdoor stairs because your fate has something to do with them." I mean, it's a very interesting story, isn't it? He used a very specific phrase to describe this even further. These are two Latin words. Unus means one, and mundus means world. This is a term used by Duns Scotus in medieval times. The one world includes both the consciousness of each individual and everything that's happening in the universe. So that your actual consciousness is beyond what you have learned in school, beyond your collection of memories from your childhood. There's a bigness about you. You have connections that go way beyond who you think you may be. We're not as limited as we imagine. And so events occur that touch in on what we're about and what we will experience and what those we love will experience. And we pick up on it even though we have no proof of it. So unus mundus, there's only one world. And Jung, commenting on this beautiful concept, says, therefore, mind and matter are simply two aspects of one reality. It makes our concern about, I just happened to think of this, but it makes our concern about climate change much more personal, because then the whole planet and the whole cosmos is somehow tied into who we really are. So in the ego's world, I'm David. Ego is a Latin word for I. So in the ego's world, I'm David from New Haven. But in the world of the higher self, in which I participate with everyone else, one self that we all share in. So I have a unique individual identity, and then I have an identity way beyond my unique history self. And that Jung called the archetypal self. And when these two come together, he called the connection of these two the ego-self axis. So we could say that synchronicity happens in moments in which this axis is really working well. So let me give another example, and I try to think of something that would be very recent, and this is as recent as yesterday. So again, we're looking for a correspondence between something that happens within yourself with a small s, and something that's happening in the larger self-universe, capital S, and somehow they come together and they tell us about our own bigness and about our important destiny. What is this destiny? Jung describes it very beautifully. It's to bring the light of consciousness into mere darkness. And that fits with my particular synchronicity. So yesterday I gave a talk on my book called Triggers at Book Passage in Corte Madera. And at lunch with a couple of friends after the talk, I happened to bring up as an example, oh, I remember, someone in the audience had asked, well, how do you work with the triggers that happen, like people trigger you into anger or trigger you into fear? And I said, well, the first step is to name your trigger. Oh, I get triggered when people criticize me. So if I can name that trigger, then when it happens, I'll be ready to handle it more mindfully rather than snap back in a retaliatory way. So this is all just the background to my story. So this topic came up there at the bookstore, which also has a lunch place. So three of us were sitting having lunch. And one of the people said, what did you mean by, naming the trigger and all that? And I said, well, it's something like the story of Rumpelstiltskin. She, the miller's daughter, was under his power until she was able to pronounce his name. You're all familiar with the fairy tale from Grimm? Mm-hmm. Are you, Beth?
I'm not remembering all of it. I know he was like asleep for a long time. That's right?
No, that's the Sleeping Beauty.
Okay.
Okay, I'll give a summary of it. Her father, who had a big ego, bragged to the king that his daughter could spin straw into gold. So the king, shall we say, took him literally and locked her in a room. Interesting, she doesn't have a name, she's just the miller's daughter. Locked her in a room and said, spin this straw into gold or else. Of course, she just sat there and grieving because she, of course, couldn't do that. A little kind of an imp, a little dwarf appeared, a grizzly old man type of person. He said, I'll spin the straw into gold if you give me your necklace. So she said, fine. He turned the straw into gold. The next day, the king was very pleased. The next day, the king locked her up again and said, do it again. She waited for the little imp, and he appeared indeed. He said, I will spin this straw into gold again if you give me your ring. So, in other words, you can see how archetypal it is, because she's getting help from someone who's actually a trickster, a shadow figure. He's up to something. It's more than a quid pro quo. The third day, the king says, okay, you have your last time to spin straw into gold, and if you do succeed, you and I will be married. But if you don't succeed, I will have you executed. So this was way before women's rights. Anyway, she sat in the room and she was in tears again, but the little dwarf appeared and he said, I'll do my final spinning of the straw into gold, but you have to give me your first infant child. And of course she She didn't like this exchange, so she didn't answer. But he went ahead and spun it anyway. She was married, she had a child, and of course he then appeared one night when she was alone in the nursery with baby. He said, "That baby's mine." And she said, "No, I never agreed to give you my baby." He said, "Oh, well, it was just understood that you would." He said, "Well, I'll tell you what, if you can guess my name, you can keep the baby." Hence the name part of the story. So, of course, she had no idea what his name was. She herself doesn't even have a name. And this is the part that struck me, because I couldn't remember the whole story, and so one of the two people looked up the story on the phone, and she told the story just as I'm telling you. But then she came to this part that I certainly didn't remember. In my version, she sees him dancing under a bridge, and he's singing a song that ends with the words, "And Rumpelstiltskin is my name." But in the actual story, and this is what fascinated me, she's deeply depressed, and she goes out at night all by herself. She leaves the castle and wanders out into the night and comes upon a little cottage. She looks through the window and she sees the dwarf dancing in front of his fireplace and singing a song, something about, tomorrow the baby's mine, and I'll have all the fame, and Rumpelstiltskin is my name. She heard the name. Next day he came and he said, "You tell me my name." And so she pretended she didn't know. She said, "Okay, let me give 3 guesses." And, she said, she gave 2 other, "Are you Hans? Are you Helmut? Are you Rumpelstiltskin?" And he got so angry that he, in some versions, he stamped his foot so hard he got stuck in the earth, and in other ones, he ran away. But in any case, she kept the baby. The part that struck me was the night journey. Woman going out all by herself, without a name, looking for a name, she's seeking. And to seek in the night is a trust in the spiritual power of darkness. So that night, I went to Mass at Jude's friary, Jude being the celebrant of the Mass. And the gospel reading from the book of St. John began with a man named Nicodemus went to visit Jesus at night. He was a seeker of spiritual knowledge, but he wasn't ready to receive it. Because when Jesus said, well, the spiritual gift that you're looking for happens when you are reborn, by which he meant when you let go of your tie to the ego world and enter into the important spiritual world of the self. It's like a new birth. You were born here as an ego, but then you're reborn into your higher self, creating the perfect axis. And he couldn't understand that. He said, well, how could a grown man go back into his mother's womb and then be reborn? He took it too literally. So I thought to myself right at that moment, oh, this hooks up with the story of the young woman. She went out searching for the emancipation, the liberation of herself and her child. And this character of Nicodemus is searching for the meaning of his own life, and both of them are doing it at night. Kind of fits with what's in the first chapter of John. The light shone in the darkness, but the darkness couldn't understand it. That's Nicodemus. He went out into the darkness, but didn't find his truth, whereas the young woman went out into the darkness and did find it. So when those two came together in my mind, I said to myself, then you, David, you have to look into your own darkness. There's something waiting to be revealed. So the two exterior stories told me, or at least I think they did, something about my internal process. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been so struck by both stories. So when you're struck by something, and you feel it strongly in your whole body mind, that means that some archetypal reality, something bigger than yourself, is constellating, is trying to come up into conscious life. Arche in Greek means the beginning, as in menarche, the first month of having a period. And type, that TYP in Greek refers to the imprint on a coin. You know, it has been struck and now shows an image. So it's kind of like the, shall we say, the original or primal imprint on our psyche, and it takes many, many forms, especially the forms of characters in stories. So, for instance, in the story of Rumpelstiltskin, we have the heroine, and we have the shadow trickster. That's the dwarf. We have the ego-driven father and the greed-driven king, both of whom represent male authority. And we have the archetype. So sometimes the archetypes have to do with specific characters, and at other times the archetypes have to do with something much more abstract, such as night, having the meaning of a darkness that nonetheless makes room for a journey toward the light in the darkness. So those would be thematic archetypes. And each of us, like a coin that's imprinted with a picture of George Washington, we're imprinted with all of these. So we have hero, heroine in us, shadow, trickster in us, father, mother, king, queen, night and day, resurrection, rebirth, death, all the themes that we encounter in the course of life. Synchronicities come along when one of these wants to come up to the surface and tell us what's next on our journey. So you want to pay attention to these coincidences that happen to you because they're directly connected to the unfolding of your destiny. So one last thing, then I'll open up for questions. Actually, two last things. One is that this has to do with chance. These are chance events. by chance, the friend of mine looked up the story, and by chance, I heard the part about she went out into the night by herself. Two types of chance. Random chance. The random chance was the bookstore happened to have a lunch room. Meaningful chance, she found the words, she went out into the night, not knowing why she went. That was an important part of it. She went out not knowing what she was looking for. I forgot to mention that. So synchronicity is meaningful chance. And mere coincidence, in other words, meaningful coincidence, but mere coincidence is random chance. Example. I came in tonight and I saw hot cross buns. And I had forgotten that in Connecticut, the bakeries make hot cross buns on every Friday of Lent. And so when I looked at the hot cross buns, I thought to myself, oh yes, they make those every Friday where I come from. Maybe here too, I don't know. But that was just mere coincidence. It's not particularly meaningful. I'm not going to eat one, and I don't have any interest in them. It's just a memory, but it's a mere coincidence. Everybody see the difference? So it's not really telling me about my destiny, but the meaningful ones are. So that's the difference. And then finally, the most important and most obvious example of synchronicity in some people's minds is astrology, which certainly is about coincidence because you're born when the stars have a certain look, and the way they look at the time of your birth is directly connected to what the rest of your life will look like. So there's a coincidence between the layout on January 14th and the layout of the rest of my life. Astro in Greek means star. The other part means study of stars. And I'm thinking of this quote from Shakespeare's The Tempest. I find my zenith doth depend upon a most auspicious star, whose influence, if I court not, but omit, my fortunes will ever after droop. I notice that if I'm to reach my full potential, my zenith doth depend. It's not just about what I'm going to do. It is connected to what the stars want of me, and I'm going to have to honor that. If I don't, then my success will disintegrate, will ever after droop. Everybody follow? So I just wanted to be sure to bring this in because I know many people relate to it. So, questions about this part? Yeah.
I have a question. I think that I always wonder, in terms of a synchronistic feeling or event, that how it seems like if you pay too much attention to it, if I pay too much attention to it, it's an ego, like I want to control it. But if I don't pay enough attention to it, it's neglected. So it does seem like there's some kind of middle place of staying open but seeking guidance from that, and not,
Yes.
not being too driven about the translation of what it means. Do you see what I'm
Oh yes, I see it very clearly. And she's making a really important distinction. So the style of the grasping ego, let's see, yeah, style of the grasping ego is keep pushing to make it reveal, and that is to control. Whereas we also have in us another style, which isn't about pushing, and this comes from what we might call our higher self, the part that doesn't grasp, the part that instead of being a grasping ego, it's a continually opening self. And the style is not pushing, but allowing the revelation to come through on its own. And of course, to do this, you would have to have trust that such a revelation wants to happen. But synchronicity tells us that. It tells us that we're not alone in our moving in the direction of our destiny. Everything around us is participating in the process. In the same way that a rose is not alone in its movement from budding to blossoming, the air, the rain, the sun, the other plants, they're all participating in the process by which the rose achieves its beautiful destiny of wholeness. And higher self is about wholeness, whereas grasping ego is about making sure that I am the one who makes things happen. So it's I-centered. I want to give one more example.
I'm going to touch a bit on that later on.
Okay, I'll just give one final example. So they did a study, as you know, Lourdes is known as a place of healing, and they did a study of the people who were healed of their physical illnesses and the people who were not given a healing. They did extensive interviews, and one of the important questions they asked was, what kind of prayers did you say to the Virgin Mary at Lourdes in order to petition her to give you a healing? The ones who were healed universally, unanimously said, we asked for a healing, but we said, I would like a healing, but I accept whatever happens. God's will. The group that didn't get a healing, please, please heal me, please heal me, heal me, heal me. That was their style. They were trying to, convince her to give the healing. Follow what I mean? So it tells you a lot about how the psyche works differently when it's in the mode of higher self than in the mode of ego. You had a comment?
No, okay. I'll come later on, yeah.
Okay. Did I answer your question?
Yes, and I thought that last example was
Okay.
really helpful.
Yeah, I like to hear the questions and I can respond to what you're wanting to know, because this is such a vast topic. And my book on this is called The Power of Coincidence, in case you're interested. Philippe?
So yeah, I don't know if it's the same question, although it feels different to me. I think it's a slightly different wrinkle. So The assumption is when you experience synchronicities, you have a sense that you're in sync with what you're called to experience, that you're in sync
Yes.
with your destiny.
Yes.
And therefore, when there are no synchronicities happening in your life, then, the corollary would be, well, so I must not be in sync with, what I'm called to experience. However, wouldn't you say that that may also be happening because you're not being given that sort of support and you are left on your own to find the direction and struggle, and that at times you may still be in sync with, connected with your higher self, as you said, and in sync with your destiny, and yet be led through a period of total darkness and no signs, no synchronicities. And then, of course, the big question comes, let's say for me, is, okay, have I been led astray? Am I completely off track, or am I still, in sync with, who I am and my destiny, and I need to persevere?
Very good question. And the first thing we find out is that the timing of revelation and transformation is completely of divine origin, not ego origin. So what we think is the right way to go about things and the right timing, I'm ready to know, tell me, does not necessarily match up with what the universe is ready to let you know. Remember Jesus saying, there are many more things that you can know, but you're not ready for them now. So it's the readiness that matters. And I think the best way to approach this is to say, I'm ready for whatever the next step will be, and I'm open to when that step will happen, rather than please make it happen now, or I'm ready now. Because we don't know what our readiness really involves.
One of the bits from Jung says, synchronicities normally appear when we are missing the promptings of the unconscious to move on the path of individuation, when we're not seeing the dreams or the signs that are being given to us. So sometimes we're missing the points that are actually calling us on, so the synchronicities come at that point to actually prompt us along. I've got one or two more things about that I'll say later.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and these are good questions because our topic is synchronicity and spirituality, and Brother Jude's going to go more into the spirituality angle of it. But the universe wants us to know when we're ready to know, but pushes, or should we say tugs, at us when we're ready and we're refusing. Because we're, as people who are free, we can say yes or no to the call of destiny. As in the quote I gave, he says, I find my zenith doth depend upon a most auspicious star, whose influence, if I court not, but omit. So I can either court it, woo it, help it along, or I can omit it. An even better example would be the quote from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is lost in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current as it serves, or lose our ventures. So he said, Brutus speaking, he's saying, the time is right for us to make a change in government here in Rome. And And I guess this fits for us nowadays too, doesn't it? Now that I think of it, this is the high tide. And if we go with it, it will help us along. But if we don't go with it, we'll be lost in misery and shallows. You know, we won't find the depth that we're designed for. We were designed to create, or shall we say, enter a full axis between our unique egos and our universal destiny. Synchronicities come along to point us in that direction. And the fulfillment of it is called individuation by Jung. Other questions? Yeah.
So let's say you have like this thing that you feel fully in your body, something's constellating, something strikes you. Like, how do you explore it? Like, what, you know, if the meaning isn't kind of readily apparent, like, how do you like sit with it in such a way as to maybe reveal more?
Well, let's use the example I gave. So I heard, look for it in the darkness twice in one day. That to me was synchronicity.
Right.
Whether or not it's true, I don't know, but I'm going to go with it anyway because it seems like a fun venture, albeit scary. And I'm saying to myself, David, you have to look into your own darkness. It's not about actual night. It's about the night inside of us where you can't quite see clearly, and yet you are moving in a direction that is going to bring you to some clarity. So I would have to kind of look into my own shadow side, let's say, and see what waits for integration, what wants to be looked at and brought into the light. So, and then I would ask the Holy Spirit, help me do this. So I would never want to do this just on my own. I would always want to bring in what represents this higher self, which in the Christian view could be the Holy Spirit, but it's whatever works for you as a kind of source of guiding wisdom that you turn to. Could be guardian angel, could be universe itself, could be the North Star. Just something that is beyond yourself, higher power, that you bring in on the process. So that's how I do it, rather than just think your way into it.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does, actually. Thanks.
Good. And also talk to friends about it, because they sometimes come up with, you know, other ideas. She went out into the night not knowing what she was looking for. Nicodemus went out at night not knowing what he was looking for. Both of them found the light. How do I, this is me speaking for all of us, how do I go into my own darkness, letting go of the need to know what I'm looking for? Reminds me of the first line of a poem by St. John of the Cross. I entered, I knew not where. I entered, I knew not where. Even letting go of, you know, where you are. So it somehow involve letting go of that masculine wish to get my GPS lined up exactly right. Other questions?
I guess I kind of have it.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I was thinking about one of the first comments you made. If we consider that mind and self are much more permeable and interrelated with the world than we traditionally think, and climate change is quite personal, Does that mean anything to you as a psychotherapist in terms of how you work with people that are living in the world as it is today? I guess my question is, how do you solve climate change through helping people as a therapist? That's not.
No.
Well, no, to respond is like, here am I sitting in the room with a client, but I'm always aware that we're not really alone here. You know, his or her a whole family is present, so is mine, and we're trying to, you know, work our way through all that. See if we can let the full picture of who you are emerge. But at the same time, we're also getting help from, and Jung was a believer in this, we're getting help from all the people in the course of history who have achieved their individuation. They don't just achieve individuation and drop their connection with humanity. They have created what he called a treasury of wisdom. And this treasury of wisdom, all of us have the ability to draw upon. It's an exact image used in Christian theology. But there it's called the treasury of graces. That all the things that Christ and Mary and the martyrs and saints endured, and all the wisdom that they found, and all the graces that they gathered, are in a treasury available to all humanity. And so all of us can draw upon the wonderful gifts of wisdom and healing and wisdom that they found. They're now available to all of us. It's a beautiful concept. And Jung took the exact concept and called it, and used the same word, treasury.
The wonderful speaker we had last month, whose name I've forgotten, so awful. Right, who's the psychiatrist, and he was involved in the Native American tribes and things. He talked to us and he said that one of the things that a lot of the Native Americans are doing is they're meeting every day to read the sacred scriptures and to bombard the ancestors to tell them they cannot allow the planet to be destroyed. And Marie-Louise von Franz, who was Jung's successor, she says, you know, we've got to argue with God. We've got to tell God he cannot allow this to happen. He's got to stop it. And that gives me great comfort. And I say to all my patients, you've got to do this every day. You've got to tell God he cannot allow this to happen. And in our community, we do this every day. We read our scriptures and we pray for the earth and we pray for the creation. We say, you cannot allow it to be destroyed. And so I think that's something we can all pass on to everybody, and we can do ourselves, whether we believe in a God who's a traditional God, or some force in the universe. We've got to do battle. We've got to stand up and fight and say, this is not acceptable. The earth is this incredible place, this island home, our fragile earth. We've got to fight for it. And you know, Jung had those visions just before he died, that when he was dying, saying, you know, the end of humanity, but we may just scrape round the corner. And I think that's the important thing. We can do that, but we've got to speak out and tell people. We've got to do it ourselves, and I do it every morning. And I think we've got to get other people to do it, to actually study things. We've got to do things, and we've got to bombard God and the forces of the universe to say, this is not acceptable. This has to go on. You know, a friend of mine says, you've got to stop grovelling to God. You've got to tell God what to do, because he doesn't always listen. So I think, you know, we've got to do this. It's our responsibility. We have to do it. We've got to take that responsibility now. So I think it's up to us. So you can do it, and I'm doing it, and get your friends to do it as well. Mm-hmm.
Okay, anybody else have any questions?
have a question.
Okay, Steve?
What about, is there an element of the trickster that would show up in synchronicity? Can you be misled by?
Yes, absolutely. And there's also something called asynchrony. A in Greek means is our version of un. In other words, unafraid, you're not afraid. So asynchrony means the time isn't right to do something, take some action, but you get some tricky info that makes you think it's the time. And, all you have to do is kind of go with it, and you'll see soon enough that it doesn't really work.
I'm going to talk about some ways you can check out synchronicity.
Oh, okay.
Good. All right, well, thank you very much for your attention, and we're going to take a short break, and then Father Jude will take over. Thank you.
The thing about synchronicities is they are fascinating. They really are. What is the purpose of them? And that's the important thing. It's not about them, it's about the purpose of them. When Jung was first discovering and really getting interested in synchronicities, which was in the 30s, he didn't write very much about them or talk very much about them, because everybody would have thought it was airy-fairy, superstitious, all this airy-fairy nonsense and things like that. So he didn't actually do a lot. He did have all these meetings with Einstein and talked about relativity, and he knew there was something connecting there. And then Jung, with Wolfgang Pauli, who was the Australian physicist who worked on quantum physics, and Jung saw a connection there. And I think if Jung had been alive today, and with all the new cosmology, he would have been in his element to have seen all the stuff. And he just began reading, then my name's gone from me, the Jesuit, Teilhard de Chardin, and he writes in his Memories and Reflections, this is one of the great prophets of our time. So he was just seeing all these other people were coming out. So he didn't write till very late in life about synchronicity. And I think he was way ahead of his time, as he was with many things. He was a true prophet. What are those things about? That's the purpose of synchronicity. It's not what they are or how interesting they are. They have a purpose. Jung's psychology, the whole psychology of analytical psychology, Jungian psychology, has a purpose. It is about getting people to wholeness. Jung's psychology is about getting every individual to become the whole person they were created to be. That's what it's all about. And as a Christian, I always say to people, and I give lots of retreats, it's not about holiness. Jung didn't talk about holiness. It's all pious claptrap, most of it. It's about wholeness. We're called to be whole. Our God is a God who is whole. We're called to discover, what is my wholeness? I'm a Franciscan friar following St. Francis of Assisi, who also was a great man and a very deep and profound man. And a mantra that he said all his life and he used every day was a very deep one that actually questioned him. And he used to go around saying, who are you, God, and who am I? Who are you, God, and who am I? And when you answer the question, who are you, God, you've then got to redefine the question, who am I, in relation to God? And when you redefine that question, you've then got to redefine the question, who are you, God? And then you've got to refine the question, who am I? And it's a vicious circle that goes on. And it keeps you going on the process of growth and individuation, never stopping growing. Because we must never stop questioning and challenging our life and what it's all about. Jung believed each of us had a personal myth. A personal myth we were called to live. Our own story that we were created to be. and that our life is about the search for that myth, the search for that wholeness, the search to be what we were called and created to be. In my consulting room, I have three plaques on the wall, 3 frames on the wall, and there are 3 sayings. One is from St. Irenaeus, who was a 2nd century bishop, and he said, "The glory of God is the human person fully alive." The glory of God is the human person fully alive. And the word I want to emphasize is fully. My second one is, Jesus said, "I have come that you may have life and have it in all its fullness." It was about fullness of life. And I do a lot of stuff about Jesus came to cast out demons. And demons are the thing inside of us that defines us as less than we are, as less than God created us to be. We're called to live fully into ourselves, to be what God created us to be. And the third one is Jung. We cannot live a meaningless existence. We're called to live our life to the full, to be full of meaning. If you'll indulge me a little and go with me in the Christian theology for a minute, Franciscan theology is a little different to traditional theology that many churches teach. Thomistic theology, as it's called. In the 1200s, there was a great battle going on between the Franciscans and the Dominicans. The Dominicans and St. Anselm all said Jesus Christ came to earth because humanity had fallen, told in that myth of the Garden of Eden. So the souls had all been lost and sold to the devil, so God had to buy them back. The only way to do that was he had to come to earth as Jesus, who then had to be sacrificed in this horrible way and buy back the souls from the devil. The Franciscans said, no, it's absolute twaddle. No, they said, Jesus, from the very beginning of time, it was written in the scriptures that God would come to earth as Jesus Christ. Not to solve a problem because it went wrong, but because he was in love with the creation. The creation took place in order for God to come and live among them. The creation took place so that Jesus could come and show them how to live and how to love and how to care for each other. The fact that when he did that, people said, we don't like what he's showing us, we don't like how he shows us up, and so they decided to kill him, was a secondary thing. This is called, Duns Scotus was the great friar who put this forward as a great university theologian, and Peter Abelard and William of Ockham, whose razor we know about, were all the great proponents of this. And it was a balance between which of those theologies will become the one that the church held. And unfortunately it went to the Thomistic one about sin and the awful price that had to be paid because it kept people down. The church was able to keep people down. Now, with a lot of Celtic theology, spirituality and theology rising, more people are becoming interested in the Franciscan way of looking at things, which is very different. But the Franciscan model also says, at the very beginning of time, when God created everything, at the Big Bang, everybody was in the mind of God. Everybody was created for a purpose. You were in the mind of God at the beginning of time. You were called into existence because from the beginning of time it was ordained that you were to be part of the creation and you have a job to do. And that's what Jung picks up about our individual myth. There's a great famous Christian novelist called Morris West who died a few years ago, wrote wonderful novels, and in one of them there's an argument going on between a priest and a young man, and the priest is telling the young man he's a terrible, wicked sinner, and the priest is, but the young man comes back and says, no, you say I'm wicked, sinful, terrible, but I say I'm not. I say I'm wonderful. Because for all eternity I was in the mind of God. If we can begin to believe that from eternity we were created, as Jung says, to achieve and do something in this world, then we can follow that myth, that bliss, as Joseph Campbell calls it, and seek to do what we're called to do. There's a Jewish story that says when we're in the womb, we know exactly what we have to do in life. And just as we're about to be born, an angel comes and knocks us on the nose and we forget. And we spend the rest of life trying to discover what that task was that we were being born to do. Our life is spent trying to discover what we are to be. Not what to do, but to be. What is it that God has called me into existence to be? David talked about the ego-self axis. That ego, that self, which is that great dynamic force, you can call it God if you like, as Jung says, and the ego, which is the power of me, that little side of me. The self, which is God, the divine spark, the higher power, however you call it, is always pushing us on to experience that wholeness, to get us to be what we're called to be. The ego doesn't want that, because the ego's task, it's called to be a loyal warrior. It's called to keep us the same person today we were yesterday, we will be tomorrow. Otherwise we'd be completely psychotic and mad. We'd be flipping back and forth. What we've got to do is kind of crumble bits of the ego and allow the power of the self in, and allow ourselves to change slowly and gradually, to allow ourselves to be transformed slowly and gradually in order to become what we were created to be. The self is pushing us to become. The quote I'll give you from this analyst called Kieran LeGrice, which is an excellent book, which is called Archetypal Reflections, says, synchronicities serve the unfolding of the self and its engagement with the conscious ego, so they tend to manifest when a deeper life meaning, initially unbeknownst to the ego, is trying to break through into conscious awareness. It's trying to break through into conscious awareness. That is when the synchronicities appear. How do we make them happen? We don't. They come to us. As I said, they normally appear when we're missing the promptings of the unconscious to move on the path of individuation. So it's usually when we're not listening to our dreams, we're not listening to ourself that's moving us on, and there is a positive move forward, and then the synchronicities appear. Individuation always involves taking on more responsibility in life, not less. We often want to let go of things, but individuation means taking on more. The ego wants us to stop doing things. It doesn't want us to change. It doesn't want any change. There's a fine line between remaining open to deeper guidance from the unconscious and seeing what one wants to see. Sometimes the synchronicity is obvious. Sometimes it needs to be engaged with. This is what happens. We have this synchronicity experience and we don't know what it is. So we've got to do amplification, like in a dream. Perhaps do an active imagination with it. Perhaps paint it or draw it, or dialogue with the figure, or ask someone else to help us look at this figure and what it's saying, or what this synchronicity means. What do they see of it? Sometimes the symbolic requires interpretation. We've got to go and look through books, we've got to go and quest, we've got to ask for clarification in the unconscious. Other times the meaning can be really plain and we just can't ignore it. It's really obvious. But we always, always, always need to be brutally honest with ourselves. And we need to watch our ego's willingness to give way and to stop change. Oh, I'd never be any good at that job, so there's no point in me doing it. They asked me to do that, but it's not really up my alley. No, I could never learn that sort of thing. how often does the ego come in and find some excuse for us not to do the thing that we're being called to do? I could never paint a picture like that. I could never draw something. I could never go on a walk or do things like that. I could never teach something. I could never stand up and give a talk about that. How many times does the ego come in and say, no, you can't do that? Watch that ego. Its task is to keep you the same today you were yesterday, you will be tomorrow. It does not like change. The ego does not like change. As Jung once said, the only thing that likes change is a baby in a dirty diaper. Always worth remembering that. So testing the synchronicities is really good. They exhaust rational explanation. Look at them, because evaluate and respond to them based on your intuition and your feeling. How many of us trust our intuition? How often do we ignore the intuitive side when it can be really giving us a message? And we can never, don't forget, you can never explain the intuitive. If somebody will say to you, you'll say, we should do this, and you'll say, why? If you can explain it, it's not an intuition. If you can't explain it, it's an intuition. I was in a business of trainers and counsellors in England, and we used to work in banks and organisations doing various things like Myers-Briggs and various group exercises. And one of my partners, Janet, would say to me, we'll do this. And I would say, why? She said, well, it'll work. Why will it work? I have no idea. She said, but it'll work. She couldn't explain it. And I knew I had to trust her because that was her intuition. And she was right. It will be perfect. Absolutely brilliant. For me as a sensate, I'm suspicious of intuitive people. But I've got to learn to trust my intuition. When I trust my own intuition, it's really right and spot on. So intuition is a good way. And when you do have a synchronicity that stands out to you, start to look around and see how many more are there that I've missed. Because you usually find, oh, hell's bells, I didn't think of that, and I didn't think of that. There are usually more than just one. The synchronicity is packed. It is packed with energy and power. So this is a way to test it. When you have the synchronicity experience, it is very powerful. It speaks to you. It stands out. It jumps out. And that's how you know there's something much deeper, much more powerful in this experience. There's a fine line, as I said, running between what's synchronicity and just coincidence. But the synchronicity, there is always that shock or the numinous. It's a numinous experience. It's something that speaks out to you, that shocks you, that actually startles you. David talked about the archetypes as well, how they manifest, and synchronicity manifests through those, so I won't go into that again. But Jung talks about the psychoid, which is the archetypal part. The archetype connects both to the internal world and the external, and how often the external is affected through the internal. This is the side that the synchronistic events occur. So I'm going to ask you, so begin to think in a minute or two about events that you may have had, but I want to tell you one or two stories of synchronistic events in my life that have been powerful that may illustrate some of these. One is I came to live in America in 1998. I had the most wonderful friend in England. When I first took a pilgrimage to Assisi in 1982, there were two little sisters on this pilgrimage. They were little old ladies with buns on the back of the head. I guided them around Rome because it's frightening in Rome, as you know, with the traffic. And And on the last night, we were having this gathering with all the 40 pilgrims. And one of the questions that the other leader asked was, what was the most wonderful thing on this pilgrimage? And what was the most wonderful thing, other experience you had in your life? And Madge said, this was this time, I can't remember. But the other thing she'd had was looking through a telescope in Australia. And I thought, how nice is it, old lady went to Australia? And probably Bondi Beach or something, looking through the telescope. You know. Well, it turned out that this little old woman, who I was helping across the road, was the world's leading nuclear solar physicist. She discovered the magnetic rays around the sun in the 50s and all the sunspots. And she ran the observatory in Oxford. She was the first woman ever to run an observatory. And she wrote all these books on the sunspots. And so I got to know Madge quite well. And I used to go up when I was living in London to Oxford on Friday afternoon. I finished work at midday. I go up to Oxford and when I was paying, we'd go to the little pub on the corner and we'd have sausage and chips. When she was paying, we'd go to the Halifax House Academics Club, which is very nice. And we got the bus back to Wolvercote, the little village she lived in. And one day she was sat next to this man on the bus, a young fella who was reading this book, and I was behind them. And she said, oh, that looks interesting. He said, you wouldn't understand this. You see, this is about the sun and magnetism. And he was explaining to her, and she was saying, oh, interesting. Interesting. And he was sort of treating her like a little old lady who didn't know boo, you know. And as we got off, she just said to him, oh, by the way, I wrote that book. And you couldn't even go to the back cover to see a picture. I mean, it was wonderful. But Madge was a great friend of mine. And I came here in 98. In August 99, I was conducting a retreat in Chicago. And I went to bed the night before I came back. And I had this vivid dream of Madge telling me what I got to do. And I got to get on with life. And I got to stop hanging on to her. And then it was time for her to go. And I said to somebody else I was with from San Francisco to come on the retreat as well, I said, I've got to ring my friend Madge when I get back, see if she's all right. I got back to San Francisco, there was a phone message to say she died that night. There's a very profound synchronistic event of someone who was actually clearly somebody telling me about my life and leading me onward and moving me forward. And I once said to her, I do envy you, Madge. You've got a doctorate and you're so clever and you're bright. She said, don't be so ridiculous. She said, and we'll talk properly when you've got your doctorate. She said, don't project onto me, she said. You've got your own gifts and skills. And I thought, you crabby old bag. But she was right, and she was teaching me how to own my own things. A synchronistic event. Another event that happened when I was working in London, and I had a patient in my practice, and I can tell you these because they gave me permission to, I've written about them, they've been in little magazines and journals. He was in his 50s, about 51. He was a professor of mathematics at the university. And mathematics, he was boring, like I think mathematics is because I'm useless at it. And he was coming for analysis, not quite sure what he was going to do with his life. And we were working through things. And I was saying to be open to everything, see what emerged. And one day he came and he was all excited. He said, I've discovered it. I know what I've got to do. I've been told. You were right, a synchronistic event happened. I've been told what to do. So I said, oh. He said, yeah. On Sunday morning, he said, I got up. I went in his apartment. He had a nice apartment near the Albert Hall. I went to the door and he said the Sunday Times had been delivered, and there was a magazine, the Sunday Times magazine, and it was all on butlers, the old-fashioned butler who used to work in a house. And now there's a school of butlery opened up, and people are wanting butlers now in homes to run the home and everything. He said, that's what I've got to do. It was so clear I've got to. I thought, oh, trumpets, I'm going to have trouble now. I said, well, let's think about it. It may be symbolic, you know. No, I've got to go and do this. I've signed up. It's a 6-month course, and they guarantee you a job at the end of it. I've resigned me, and he was the head of maths. He had a tenure at the thing. He said, I'm finishing. And I thought, oh, Lord, you know, I was so worried about this. So he went off, and he came back at different times. It was off in the countryside in Essex in some stately home somewhere. Kept going back to see him. He loved it, absolutely loved it. And at the end, he got a job. And he got a job with some Greek millionaire who had a house in Hawaii, a house in Greece, a house in London, and who travelled between all these places. And he took him with him. And he did everything for him. He booked his flights, he organised his clothes, he did everything. He absolutely loved it. And what happened was, when he was in Greece, and this man was off at meeting things, he was sat on this island, began reading poetry. Never read poetry in his life. Then he began writing poetry. Then he published a book of poetry. And he came and brought me a book of poetry when I was in London. And for 10 years, he travelled all the world with this man. And it was amazing. And then he retired and he got a place in the country somewhere. And I used to hear from him regularly, send me little Christmas cards. He believed and trusted in that synchronicity. It was a message of what he'd to do and what he'd to be. I was one who was scared when he discovered it. But he responded. That synchronicity came to him and opened up his life. Another patient I was working with, I was having difficulty connecting with her. We just weren't really connecting. And she was a bulimic. And I couldn't quite understand, the whole thing. And I was saying, well, just stop eating, She, one day I was out in town in London. I was out in the middle of the day. And I'm allergic to chocolate. I get terrible migraines with chocolate. And I saw these Mars bars. Now, when I was a child, I loved Mars bars. And I had this passion for a Mars bar. So I bought one and I ate it. And then I bought another and I ate it. And I bought another and I ate it. And I ate 12 Mars bars. Did I feel ill? She came to see me that evening and she said, "You've no idea how ill I feel. I've just eaten 12 Mars bars." And I thought, oh shit. So at that point, there was a connection between us. And I began to understand that again, inside the illness that she was feeling, what synchronistic event would have caused that to happen? It was amazing. At that point, the analysis began to work. And her life changed. And I was very ill for 2 days. But there we are. Another person I worked with in San Francisco, she was trying to discover what to do with her life, what she was going to... She'd worked in an office for years and years. She was on the 33 bus, coming along Mission and coming up 18th Street, and she was sat there. She looked over her shoulder to the woman in the bus in front, and there was an advertisement saying there was a shortage of nurses in San Francisco. She said, "That's what I've got to be, a nurse. That's it, I've got to be a nurse." And she trained to be a nurse, and then she wanted to be a clinical nurse specialist, and then a physician's assistant. And she's been doing that for the last 10 years. Suddenly, they're the synchronistic things that when we're open, when we're really open to the things, they will come out and jump at us and bite us. When I used to read the books when I first began training, I used to think, I don't believe any of this stuff happens. It's all twaddle. But it happens so often to me and to people I work with. I was, from being in the other side, when I was in charge of the community in North and South America, which was for 12 years, and I used to travel a lot. And I would go up and down to houses in Brazil and all over. And I used to go back and forth to New York, once, twice a week. And often I would just go get the night flight across to New York and come back the next day because there'd be meetings going on. And one day I had to go across to Brooklyn to our priory there. And one of the brothers said, I was just going across the 10 o'clock flight at night and coming back on the 6 o'clock one from New York. He said to me, somebody's delivered a monstrance to the friary to bring to Brooklyn. Now, many people will not know what a monstrance is. So I brought one to show you. This is show and tell. This is because it's what we use for what we call Eucharistic adoration. Now you can see this. Mine was a little similar to that, but not quite the same. Well, so I decided I didn't take checked luggage. I only took a hand luggage. So I thought, I'm going to get this in. So I took my hand luggage, and I didn't wear a habit because I was travelling and I was getting buses and trains at the other end. So I wrapped it in my habit and put it in with me clean clothes and things into the bag. And I got to the airport and I put it on the X-ray machine, and it went through. And I could see people behind going. Then they said, "We'll have to look at this." So they opened the bag and they took everything out. So my knickers were there, and my shirt, and everything, my habit and my rope, and this was laid the one that was there. And I thought, what's going on? They said, "We have to send for the supervisor. We're not sure you can take that on board. It could be a weapon." I thought, well, it is a weapon for the gospel, but it's slightly different. But so I thought, this is odd. So then somebody came and they said, we have to get the area supervisor. So I was sat there. And then this young man came, probably about 30, and he looked at this stuff and he went white. And he said, "Can you come in this room?" So he said, I said, "It's called a monster." He said, "I know what it's called," he said. "I want to show you something." So he had a laptop and he showed me. And in his dream, he'd recorded from the day before, from the night before, he dreamed of a Franciscan friar in brown coming to the airport with a monstrance. And what he'd said to his spiritual director the day before was, "If I see a Franciscan friar with a monstrance, I'll definitely go and train as a priest."
Wow.
Now, this is so odd and peculiar. And he went to St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park after this and trained as a priest. And he was in touch with me for ages, and he's now in somewhere, I can't remember where. I was in somebody else's synchronistic dream. Strange, very strange feeling to have that happen. It's happened so many times to me where people have said, "You've been in my dream last night," or something like that. When we start to follow these things, it's amazing how those things can happen to each of us. Synchronicity is a very deep and profound thing, and it's sending a message to us, and often we're part of something that's living in somebody else's life. What I say to you is, when you have these experiences, live into them. Ask yourself, what is it that this is about? Don't ignore it. What are you being called into? What is you being called to? What is your unconscious asking you to do, to step into, to look for? All of us are on this incredible journey. We all have an incredible myth to live. And, it doesn't matter how old you are. You keep going and discovering that myth. I always say to the people, I want to push my own button on the crematorium when they push me in. I want to live to the full, right to the end. We're all called to discover this myth, this bliss, and synchronicity is a way that will help us do that. So they're just a few things about synchronicity. I've got endless notes here, but I want to ask you, are there experiences that you've had that actually, smack of synchronicity, or that perhaps you're thinking now are to do with synchronicity, that could affect your life?
I have one. I ended up, after spending some time living here in San Francisco and getting a little bit disenchanted and bored with my life, I followed a friend to Molokai, Hawaii, and we learned permaculture and lived off the grid there for a while. And I fell in love with someone there, and he was known by his father and the community. He was called Mowgli, because he was a jungle boy, grew up in the jungle. And he had gotten into some, we spent a few months together, and then I came back to San Francisco for some time. And then while I was away, he had gotten into some trouble, and I went back home to South Carolina to spend some time with my family. And a friend of mine picks me up, a friend I haven't seen in a while. She picks me up in her car to go to lunch, and she pulls off her dashboard a little Mowgli figurine. And she was like, "Look what I found in the parking lot." And I was just like, it was just the wildest thing. You know, I guess some child might have dropped it, but I don't even think about the Jungle Book at all, or, you know, those characters, and it felt like such a wildly significant, you know, experience that I ended up going back to Molokai to try to help him out. But I don't know if I would have done that or had felt as
Right.
convicted in that decision had a friend not handed me a Mowgli
Yeah.
figurine in Charleston, South Carolina, you know, several thousand miles away.
Yeah, right, yes, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
that was one.
Mm. Mm.
Well, piggybacking on your chocolate story, so, you know, even though my previous question was about the absence of synchronicities in my personal life occasionally, however, in my clinical work, what I've often noticed is that clients will be presenting with issues that are exactly the issues that I'm working on. And actually, it's been happening so often now that I almost expect it to happen.
Right.
And it's the most mysterious thing to me that this will be happening.
Yeah. Mm.
And can you comment on that?
No, it is. It's amazing how many times, you know, you're going through something and they will come with exactly the same thing, or they'll say, "How would you deal if you were doing it?" Or, what is this? And you think, if only you knew. You know, you can't say, you know, I'm going to do it. And it's, I think there is, I think sometimes we touch in them something, some complex in them that's allow them to experience it, or to bring it to consciousness and to work on it, that they feel safe with it. They'll talk about something that they wouldn't be prepared to talk about at any other time or with any other person, because it's like, you know, the grid of the, you know, the AABBCCC, the cross, you know, the dialogue between conscious and unconscious. It's like there's something going on here at the bottom, which is connecting both of you. And it's both, it's the unconscious area working together, that you're not aware of, but you are doing something with that person. You're affecting them in a deep way. It's like the counter-transference, but it's on that deep unconscious level. And they're sensing that this is something that is now time to emerge, that can be emerged, that can come up, yeah.
And it's almost as if, you know, the client comes in my life as I'm being invited to look at something that I may have been ignoring, or that I'm
Yeah.
struggling.
Yeah.
You know, that he comes as a gift from, you know, whatever.
Yeah, yeah, I think that happens so many times. David, what would you say about that?
I agree. You know, and I've seen the same thing happen.
Yeah, I think that's why Jung said that for training, the most important thing is your own analysis, so that you're ready for what emerges with the person. Because it really is important. You never, you know, but you can have an idea sometimes. Yeah.
I don't know if this is synchronicity or just a blast of intuition, and it's kind of contrary, but I remember many years ago, when I first got to San Francisco, I drove by Green Gulch, the Zen Center, and I was kind of lost, you know, in my life at that time, and I thought, the Zen Center, that's a good idea, like, the Zen Center, and I heard absolutely not.
Oh,
No, and I don't hear voices.
right.
But it was so clear a message, no. And I think looking back, it probably would have been not a good idea.
Right.
But anyway, so
Yeah.
I don't know how you would fit that.
Right, but it's definitely a message from the unconscious. I think when you have those real clear voices that come out to you, you have to listen to them, because they're coming right from the unconscious and they're making it clear. Yeah, sometimes we don't want to ignore them. We think that wasn't fantasy, but they really are. Sometimes the unconscious makes something really clear, and you have to do it. You should respond. Yeah.
What about the really clear questions?
Like,
When you are so very much seeking guidance, and there's there's just a question that you have for yourself.
mhm.
what to do. And I wanted to remark that when you brought up ego and you kept saying, don't let the ego interfere with you can't do that or you shouldn't do that. But oftentimes the ego might also be saying you should do that. And so I think I don't want to create too long of an aside with my own personal concern, but when you have a really clear question and you're sort of looking, I don't want to say the grasping ego pushing to find necessarily, but does anybody or yourself have any sort of advice on how to navigate and receive?
Jung talks about the tension, the tension of the opposites. When there's something you're trying to a question or something you're trying to answer, to live in the tension of the opposite, to pull them apart, what is the question, how am I going to respond to this? And he says the tertium non data, the third symbol will come through the middle that will reunite. And often if you can live in the tension of not knowing for a while, suddenly the answer will come. And it usually comes from somewhere, from the unconscious. It will just suddenly hit you. No, this is what I have to do. Or this is the correct thing. This is right for me. Or no, I mustn't do this. It's living in the tension. It's keeping it active and keeping it alive all the time, which is like pulling the two apart. So the tension is always there. And I've always found, when I've been asking those questions and trying to decide what to do, whatever, to live with the tension and to wait, just wait and see what emerges. And always the answer comes, or somebody else brings the answer to me. And it will be so, obvious. Somebody will say, I was thinking the other day of you, and I think how stupid it would be if you went to do this. Somebody else was going to do this, and they said you would like to, and I said, no, that would be really ridiculous. Somebody else can give me the answer. So sticking with your own, unconscious and pulling that apart and waiting for that third symbol that will reunite to emerge, the answer will come if you trust your own unconscious. And you do really know when the ego is pushing you along and when it's lying to you. You can tell. We all don't want to, but you can actually tell if you're truthful. Yeah, yes, yeah.
And it also has to do with, is this on?
Yes.
Yeah. It also has to do with respecting the mystery of timing. Like the ripening into the decision or the knowledge is not in our control. I'm thinking of this quote from Othello. There are many events in the womb of time that wait to be delivered. So there are things inside of us that the timing of when they will be revealed is beyond our control.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why sometimes it's a matter of the waiting.
But don't you think it's also hard that we live in a culture that really expects an answer right away?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Computer-wise, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's one of the big challenges today, and one of the big problems we're having with technology, is that everything, the forceful nature of everything, and not having the time to stop, and spend time to contemplate and meditate on something.
It doesn't even seem like an option anymore.
No.
You don't even, I think often people don't think, waiting and seeing is not even one of the options.
No. No, it's scary.
Yeah.
Mm.
And to address your predicament, I've forgotten your name, on a practical level, I sometimes find that going to a spiritual director rather than a psychotherapist is more helpful, and that spiritual directors are trained in discernment, whereas we clinicians are trained more in healing.
Mm-hmm.
And I have found that working with a spiritual director in a situation that you describe to be particularly helpful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think the thing to always remember is that you are a unique mystery. you know, and you were created for a purpose, and you're part of a great plan. I always say to people, it's like a huge, great jigsaw puzzle, and you're one of those pieces, and you've got to decide which way around you fit in that jigsaw puzzle and what you're called to do. So, you know, to see yourself as something that is really important, and acknowledge your importance and your value and your worth, and to ask those questions about what is it I'm meant to be doing, what is it I'm meant to be, you know, what is my task now as part of this unfolding, of this continued unfolding of creation. And you know, we say that, you know, the redemption didn't just take place once, it's continually being redeemed. The earth is being redeemed, and you have a role in all of that. So to take it and to actually live into it, and it's like Francis with, you know, your art is part of that. It's an important part. It's creating something which is wonderful and beautiful, and manifesting that to the world is so important. So I think things like that, what is it that you're going to be and you're going to do, and what can you live into as your myth, because they're so important. You know, whether you write poetry and you know, and as I say to lots of people, you know, paint, but you don't have to show it to anybody. You know, you can throw it away. It's actually putting stuff out there, or writing poems, or writing stories. You think of people like Emily Dickinson and people who wrote hundreds, thousands of poems, never published in their life, and all the other people have written things, or people who paint things, which never get seen. It's the importance of bringing the creative forces and energies from yourself out and birthing them into the world. That's what we've got to do. That's what's going to change and transform the world, is when we can all do that. And all of us have hidden gifts and skills that we don't tap into, and we've got to give birth to them. And that's what we've got to work on, to keep the world going, to transform this world that's falling apart at the minute. So discover your gifts, discover your skills, discover what you can do, and do it. Live it. See yourself as being an integral part of this creation, and see yourself as being one who can change things and make things better and can alter the course of history at the minute. So see your role in that and do it. Elaine, who isn't here today because she's not well, but you know, 80 she published her first book of poetry. You know, things like that. You know, you can do it. Everybody can do it. But don't listen to the ego that says, there's nothing I can do. You know, I can't do anything. I'm no good at things. Fight through that voices. You know, that's the demon on the shoulder that says, you'll never do anything, you'll never be any good. You know, the demon is that which defines you as less than you are, defines you poorly. So don't let it. I was looking at the various books of Jung on synchronicity, but I did just notice one or two others that I've been looking at. There's one by David Wilcox, which is more like, it's like a novelish sort of thing, but on synchronicity. And this one by Dr. Kirby Surprise. Do you really have a name called Surprise? He's from CIIS, so I mean, I don't know, but he's written quite interesting pieces in it. Anybody who's interested in journaling will have heard of Ira Progoff from the Progoff journal system. He's written, this is a very good book called Jung, Synchronicity and Human Destiny. Jung's Meaningful Coincidence. That's an interesting book. Then there's a series of books come out recently, which are just, I use them a lot for people. There's an introduction to Jung, a complete introduction, which is really good. And then there's this one called Jung's Key Ideas, and they give you just the key ideas and little ways to remember them. Both of these are very good. And this one is called Ruth Williams Jung, The Basics. And these are just little books. They've got sections on synchronicity, but also on Jungian terms and Jungian things, and they're quite interesting to look at. So there are a few books that but this one is one of the good ones, which is Archetypal Reflections by Kieran LeGrice, Pacifica Graduate Institute, California. So we'll be all right. But there are a few things if you wanted to read more.
This isn't quite about a synchronicity, but sometimes when you feel those moments and you feel that like whole body shock, like, oh my God, I'm on the right path, or this is, how do you work with when it can go to an ego place of like, I'm a magician, and you kind of like abrogate, what's that word, when you like you think that you have the power when maybe it's really the universe is the divine. Does that make any sense? Like, do you personally navigate that feeling of like expansion and then thinking that you are responsible for the magic of the universe and you're totally not, but not diminishing yourself? No. How do you stay?
In other words, the opposite of what you brought up. This would be the inflated ego. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
I think so.
Yeah.
Because it's pretty powerful to feel those moments of connection to something bigger than yourself.
Yeah, and you've got to, this is where you've got to be, the question of honesty comes with yourself, because often they're very powerful experiences that are being given to you. Yeah. So what do you take from them? What do you live into? What energy do you take from them? And be careful not to just put yourself down or allow them to be, allow yourself to rubbish them or say they're just fantasies, or it's just me. You know, it's just the chocolate working through, or the sugar. You know, live into it. Say, what is the message I'm getting from this? Always looking about what is the positive thing that's coming from it. You know, that's the thing, to always look at that, to see what is coming from this. What am I being told? What gift am I being given? Because often the profound and deep things that are coming to you from the unconscious, and they do come through. And sometimes some of the things, I think, in the unconscious, this push to wholeness and this drive to wholeness, sometimes they've got to really force the way through, because many of us have had damage. The ego and the self, and if you imagine it's the sun and the moon, many people have had a lot of damage growing up, and that damage is along that ego-self axis. And so it's like putting a screen up. So the moon doesn't reflect the light of the sun, or it doesn't experience the positive. And analysis is actually repairing the ego-self axis a lot of the time, so that the ego can experience the positive that's coming from the self. I can believe I'm a good person. I can believe I'm positive. I can believe I've got good things to offer the world. I'm not the nasty, horrible person that was locked in the cupboard by parents, or told I was a horrible child, or I'd never become anything. So you've got to mediate those two and help that healing along that ego-self axis, so that the ego does believe in itself. Because if it becomes all negative and very, told it's useless and hopeless, it will always move to that. It's like water running downhill. It will automatically, you'll go to the negative. So many people, everything in life is negative because they've been told that all their lives, and they will always move to the negative. We've got brothers in community who are like that. They will always find the negative. And so getting them to believe anything positive is really difficult sometimes. And if you tell them the positive, they can't cope with it. One of my supervisors used to say to me, what you do is you put a few crumbs out, and when they can take the crumbs, you put a bigger crumb out. You never give them a full meal though. Just wait till they can take a few crumbs, and then when they can do that, they can handle something bigger. But watch them, because don't try and overfeed them, because they can't cope with it. So much negativity. People, we're in a world where many people have been told by parents, teachers, neighbours, family, of the useless, hopeless, or whatever, and that lives in them, and you'll see it in so many people. So work with that, and work with your own damaged, wounded side, to let that positive come in, that repair that damage on the ego self axis, so you do believe in yourself. So sometimes the self has really got to push hard to get through, to say, you are all right, listen to me, you silly old fool, and it makes you have some experience. And so look at that experience and see, what is it saying? It's saying, actually it's saying, I'm a really good thing. And own it and integrate it and live into it.
I just wanted to say, your question made me think there's a poem by Seamus Haney called Casting and Gathering, which is really a description of like the negative voice and the positive voice. You know, I'm fantastic and I'm nothing. And how we swing between those two places, and just recognizing that they're both our voices, you know, that they're there. And as an artist, I think an artist goes between those voices every day. You know, this is horrible. It's horrible. This is fantastic. And they both are legitimate voices, but you can't stay with either one of them. You know that. But I think just it's a beautiful poem if you can find it. Thank you.
And also, I was going to respond to, the other part you brought up about, sometimes we overdo it and we have this inflated view of ourselves. We think we're much more than we really are. And I have two kind of responses. One is the sense of gratitude. Like, I want to let myself feel more of how the gifts that I have are gifts that I'm meant to use for the universe, not just for my own aggrandizement. And synchronicity is the archetype of grace, free gifts that are given to us so that we can know what next step to take on the journey. And then the other way of working with it is do nothing at all, and soon enough the trickster will come along and topple you and show you you're not all you're cracked up to be, and kind of cut you down to size. So that's another possibility. We don't make that happen, it just comes along.
I immediately thought of a quote I had read, and I just tried looking for it, but Chogyam Trungpa had, I'll have to paraphrase because I couldn't find it, but he said something like, when you can remove ego from a situation, then true precision and grace can descend upon it, and that the magic of the earth belongs to everyone, that no one can possess it. It sounded like it was pretty relevant to your question.
Any other questions?
Well, it's just a comment, about the positive versus the negative voice within ourselves about who we are. So I think that's one challenge. But the challenge for me these days is more about how to hold a positive view of the times we're going through, when we, or at least I myself, experience them as so dangerous and toxic and frightening. So how do you balance? How do you face that dilemma?
When the inflated ego is at the helm of government, it will be frightening to everyone and destabilizing. And our style is to grieve and organize. We're sorry it's like this, and we're doing all we can to change the way it is. But it is normal that you're going to feel scared, destabilized, confused, because the ego is never meant to be at the helm. The helm was supposed to be in the hands of someone who has genuine integrity and cares more about the success of the great venture of democracy than his own interests. So when it isn't like that, it'll feel very disturbing, and you wind up feeling powerless, and that's how we lose. When we feel powerless and don't take action, that's when fascist and other kinds of powers gain even more control over us. So that's something to keep in mind. Any other questions for either of us? Yeah.
One comment that sort of echoed off of what you were saying, Jude, is I've been seeing a career counselor who takes the idea of vocation on a very deep level, and on her office wall she has a picture of the Annunciation of Mary, and she has a a little sculpture of a burning bush. And she said in both cases, Moses and Mary, when they were told by God what they should be doing, they turned God down. They said, no, I don't want to do that. And God had to ask, I think, Moses 4 times to remind him of what he should be doing. So, which is something I identified with a great deal. I think I have a lot of resistance to vocation.
Well, that's because the ego, it seems as if the ego is being addressed, which has this deflated sense of itself that Jude was talking about. But actually, the calling was going to the higher self that we're all participating in. And we just didn't trust that we have that kind of divine power also. See what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
So we say no just thinking of ourselves in our ordinary consciousness. But if we were to trust that we're also part of a bigger enterprise of human evolution that is moving relentlessly toward more consciousness and more connection, and that each of us has a calling to help that happen, and that that's the part that's being addressed by the divine voice, then we would step up to the plate more easily, because then we would be trusting that if we did receive such a calling, surely we will be equipped with the graces to fulfill it. And we won't have to rely only on our small toolbox, our limited talents and powers. Something bigger will kick in that will help us. As Joseph Campbell says, a door will open where we didn't realize there was a door, and life will step in to help us. But if you only come from ego, you wouldn't have that peace. And so, of course, you would say no. But I'm remembering a phrase from 2 Corinthians regarding Jesus. In him, there was only yes. In him, there was only yes. Imagine living that kind of a life where you're in this continual yes to the destiny that you're called to. Synchronicities come along to remind us of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.